December 1944. The bitter winter wind whipped across the deck of the transport ship. Inside the cold metal belly of the vessel, a group of German prisoners of war huddled together, shivering, silent. Among them was Klaus Miller, a veteran of Hitler's army hardened by years of fighting in Poland, France and North Africa. His uniform, once crisp and proud, now hung loose on his frame, worn and faded. Klaus had seen death up close, had marched with pride under the Reich's banner, and believed without question in the propaganda fed to him by Joseph Goebbels. Now he and thousands of other men were being transported across the Atlantic. Their orders were clear: survive. Their minds were filled with fear, confusion, and hatred. They had been told that the Americans were monsters, barbarians who would torture and kill them without hesitation. Every POW clutched their paybook, some held letters from home, most had nothing but dread. Klaus stared at the ceiling of the ship, imagining the horrors that awaited him. He could see it all: barbed wire, harsh guards, starvation, maybe even execution. The journey was long and cold. The men's nerves frayed as waves rocked the ship. Every sound, a creaking metal beam, a shout from a sailor, made their hearts jump. When they finally arrived at an American port, Klaus braced himself, ready for the nightmare. But what he saw instead was unexpected. The train that carried them inland was slow, rattling over frozen tracks. Through the windows, the prisoners saw a world that did not match the stories they had been told. Endless fields of golden corn stretched to the horizon, dotted with neat farmhouses, smoke curling from chimneys. Cows grazed peacefully, and the snow-covered land looked almost peaceful, almost welcoming. The prisoners stared, confused. Where was the devastation? Where were the starving citizens? Where was the cruelty they had been promised? The train rattled on, and Klaus felt a flicker of unease. Something about this abundance, this calm, did not fit into the world he had known. He looked around at his fellow prisoners. They were all equally silent, eyes wide, trying to reconcile what they saw with what they had been taught. The propaganda had painted Americans as monsters, yet here was a land full of life, full of warmth, full of order. The contrast was jarring, almost painful. When the train finally stopped, the men were herded off and marched toward a compound surrounded by barbed wire. This was Camp Alona, Iowa, a sprawling camp designed to hold thousands of prisoners. Guards with M1 rifles flanked the paths, but there was no shouting, no violence. The men were processed, their belongings catalogued, and their clothes inspected. Klaus's mind raced. Every step seemed too easy, too quiet, too civilized. Inside the camp, the barracks were simple but warm. He expected cold, damp bunks, thin blankets and gruel, but instead he found sturdy beds and clean linens. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and cooking. For the first time in months, Klaus noticed the absence of fear in himself, but the feeling was confusing, even terrifying. How could this be? How could the enemy, the Americans, treat prisoners with such care? As night fell, Klaus lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. The camp was quiet except for the soft snores of men he had once thought of as comrades only in war. He thought of the Eastern Front, of the frozen fields and the screaming artillery, and then he thought of this place. Warm, calm, safe. A contradiction unlike anything he had experienced. He clenched his fists, trying to force the confusion away, but the seed of doubt had already been planted. Even more unsettling was the thought of home. Klaus had left a daughter, Annalisa, in Stuttgart, 6 years old, now likely wondering why her father had not returned. He had carved her a wooden doll months before he was sent to the front. The memory was sharp and painful, but it was soon overshadowed by the strange peace of Iowa. For the first time, Klaus questioned what he had believed all his life. Was this perhaps a trick? Could this kindness be a trap? His mind could not reconcile the warmth he saw with the horrors he had been taught to expect. And yet, he was not alone in his confusion. Around him, other veterans of the Afrika Korps and Luftwaffe pilots whispered in hushed tones, sharing the same disbelief. Some laughed nervously, others shook their heads, refusing to believe their eyes. The rigid certainty of their ideology was cracking, just a little, under the strange weight of compassion. Outside, snow began to fall, dusting the camp in silence. It was peaceful, almost serene. Klaus stared out the small window, taking in the quiet beauty of the American heartland. The enemy he had been trained to hate was nowhere in sight. There was only order, only calm, only normal life. And in that moment, Klaus Miller felt something he had not felt in years: uncertainty. The question now was not survival, not war, not orders. The question was deeper, more dangerous. How would a man who had been trained to kill react to kindness? How could hatred survive in a place where every expectation of cruelty was turned upside down? The answers were unknown, but one thing was certain. Klaus Miller's world had begun to change. And change, in the middle of winter in the heart of Iowa, was only just beginning. The first night in Camp Alona arrived with a cold so sharp it cut through the thin barracks walls. Klaus Miller lay awake on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts a storm of fear, confusion, and anger. He had been trained to expect cruelty from the Americans, yet the camp had been quiet all day. Guards had spoken only when necessary, their faces unreadable. The barracks were warm, the bunks clean, the blankets thick. Every detail of normal life seemed a betrayal of the world he had known, a world filled with suffering, war, and death. When the first bell rang, signaling dinner, Klaus rose slowly, his muscles stiff from the long journey. He followed the line of prisoners into the mess hall, expecting hard biscuits, thin soup, and cold water. He had imagined a punishment, a reminder of who was in charge. He had expected humiliation and hunger. What he saw instead froze him. Tables were lined with steaming bowls of beef stew, thick slices of bread waiting beside them, butter and a steaming mug of black coffee for each man. The smell hit him first, rich, hearty, alive. His stomach clenched, a mix of disbelief and longing stirring deep inside. His comrades looked around, eyes wide, silent, almost afraid to take a bite. It seemed too perfect, too generous, too human. Klaus stared at the steaming stew in front of him. His hand trembled as he reached for the bread. The warm crust broke beneath his fingers, and he caught a whiff of butter melting into the soft, white interior. It was more than food, it was a message, one he could not yet understand. The taste was simple, yet extraordinary. He had not eaten like this for years. Not in the deserts of North Africa, not in the frozen trenches of the Eastern Front, not even during the brief rests at the front lines. This was abundance, comfort, and care, all wrapped into a single steaming meal. Around him murmurs spread. Some men whispered, "Is this a trick?" Others shook their heads, unable to reconcile the food with the world they had been taught to hate. Klaus's mind raced. He remembered the propaganda. Americans were cruel, greedy, savage. They would kill prisoners, starve them, make them suffer. And yet here was proof that it was all a lie. Proof that the enemy could be human. Too human. He watched his fellow prisoners eat cautiously at first, some picking at the stew as though it might bite back. Then, slowly, hunger won over fear. Forks scraped bowls, bread was torn apart, and the murmur of contentment began to rise. Klaus chewed, silently, trying to hide the shock on his face. Each bite was a betrayal of everything he had believed. Each swallow pulled at a deep knot inside him, the knot of certainty that had been drilled into him for years. Sitting across from him, other POWs whispered about their families. Some had not eaten properly in months. Some had letters from home unopened, afraid of the news they might contain. Now, in this strange American camp, they were fed better than they could remember. The injustice of it burned Klaus from the inside out. The anger, the confusion, the disbelief, it was overwhelming. Sergeant Miller, the camp guard overseeing the meal, watched silently from the edge of the room. He was a veteran of the First World War, a man whose life had been built on experience, loss, and hard decisions. He had seen men at their worst, he had seen rage, fear, and hatred. And yet, he also believed in the American way, the rule of law, the Geneva Convention, the principle that even enemies deserved basic humanity. He noted Klaus Miller's stiff posture, his trembling hands, his wide eyes, and he understood without words that the propaganda had failed. Already the rigid belief of a soldier had begun to crack. After the meal, Klaus and the others were returned to their barracks. He sat on his bunk, staring at the floor, the taste of bread and stew lingering in his mouth like a bitter reminder. For the first time he questioned everything he had believed. Was it possible that all his hatred had been built on lies? Could the enemy be human? Could kindness be a weapon more powerful than a rifle? These thoughts were dangerous. They were forbidden. But they would not be silenced. Sleep came fitfully that night. Klaus turned over in his bunk, staring at the ceiling beams. He thought of the streets of Berlin, of his daughter Annalisa, of the cold, empty barracks he had left behind. He thought of the men he had killed, the towns he had marched through, the villages burned, the lives lost. And then he thought of the warm meal, of the clean blankets, of the calm faces of Americans. His mind could not reconcile these truths. Confusion and rage fought inside him like two armies. By morning, the camp had settled into a quiet routine. Work details were assigned, chores completed, and the prisoners were observed carefully. Klaus, however, walked with a new burden, the knowledge that the enemy could be humane. Each step he took carried the weight of doubt. He watched the cornfields stretch endlessly, the neat farmhouses, the smoke curling from chimneys. A small voice in the back of his mind whispered that the world he had known was not the only one. That perhaps the cruelty and hate he had embraced were not inevitable. It was in this quiet, in the simple act of sharing a meal, that the first seed of change was planted. Not through bombs or guns, not through threats or torture, but through kindness. And Klaus Miller, fanatical soldier, Overleutnant, hardened veteran, would never be the same. The POWs had arrived expecting hell. Instead they found warmth, food, and humanity. And for men trained to hate, this was the most dangerous weapon of all. The snow lay thick across Camp Alona, a silent blanket that muted every sound. Klaus Miller walked the narrow paths between the barracks, his boots crunching softly against the frozen ground. His mind was heavy, weighed down not by hunger or cold, but by a new and unfamiliar feeling, confusion. The Americans had fed him, housed him, and treated him with a level of care he had never expected. The propaganda he had believed for years had crumbled like dry sand in his hands, leaving only questions. Klaus's thoughts drifted to his daughter Annalisa. He had not seen her in 6 long years. A child who had once been the center of his world, now likely living in a city scarred by bombs, struggling to survive in a country at war. Klaus had carved her a small wooden doll before he was sent to the front, a tiny figure, crude yet filled with love. That memory, once a source of warmth, now burned him with pain. He had been trained to kill, trained to obey without question, trained to embrace the ideology of the Reich. And yet, here he was, powerless in the face of a kindness that made him feel human again. That morning, Klaus was assigned to a work detail at a nearby lumber yard. The cold bit at his fingers, his breath forming clouds in the icy air. He carried planks of wood from one pile to another, his movements mechanical, his mind elsewhere. And then he saw her. A little girl no older than 6, bundled in a bright red coat and scarf, walking with her mother across the street. In her small mittened hand she held a doll. A rag doll, worn and tattered, its button eyes loose. Klaus froze. His heart pounded in his chest. The doll was simple, yet it was the same kind he had made for Annalisa years ago. The sight of it transported him back to another life, another world. A world where he had been a father, not a soldier, a man who created rather than destroyed. Time seemed to slow. Klaus's hands, rough and calloused from years of war, clenched the plank he was holding. His breath caught. The little girl stumbled on the icy curb, and the doll slipped from her grasp, landing face down in the slush. She cried out, reaching for it, but her mother hurried her away, leaving the toy behind. Klaus stared at the doll, lying in the dirty snow, and something inside him shattered. It was not a sound that broke him, nor a thought. It was a feeling, a deep, hollow, aching grief that clawed at his chest. For the first time in years he felt the weight of everything he had done. The wars he had fought, the orders he had obeyed, the lives he had destroyed. And here, in the middle of Iowa, thousands of miles from the battlefields, the ghosts of his past had found him. Sergeant Miller, standing nearby, noticed Klaus's sudden stillness. His experienced eyes saw the change immediately, the rigidity, the arrogance, the fanatical pride, all gone. Klaus Miller, the Overleutnant, was no longer the same man. He staggered back to the truck, dropping the plank, his head in his hands. Silent tears streaked his face. The other POWs watched in confusion. They did not understand. They could not. But they sensed a shift. Something inside Klaus had begun to break, and with it, the unyielding chains of ideology that had bound him for years. That night, back in the barracks, Klaus did not eat. He did not sleep. He lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, the image of the doll burned behind his eyes. His bunkmates whispered among themselves, watching the transformation. The Overleutnant who had once walked with arrogance and pride was now hollowed, trembling, and quiet. The war, the ideology, the orders, they all seemed meaningless in the face of something so small, so human, so simple as a child's toy. By the next morning, Klaus had made a decision. He could not undo the past, nor could he return to the man he had been. But he could create. He could carve. In the quiet of the barracks, under the thin wool blanket, he pulled out the small scraps of pine he had saved from the lumber yard. His hands, trained for disassembling guns and machinery, were stiff and clumsy with delicate work. Yet, guided by the memory of his daughter and the image of the girl in red, he began to carve. At first the shapes were crude. Small wooden soldiers, tiny animals, simple toys, but each one carried the weight of his grief, his hope, and his desire for redemption. The other prisoners watched from the shadows, curious, wary. Among them was Eric, a young Luftwaffe pilot, cynical and hardened, who saw Klaus working with a focus he had never witnessed before. When he asked what he was doing, Klaus only showed him the photo of his daughter. Eric understood wordlessly. The secret was safe. The barracks, once filled with anger and tension, began to change. The rhythm of carving, the quiet scratching of knives against wood, brought a strange peace. Men who had been soldiers of death began to reclaim pieces of their humanity. They were still prisoners. They were still Germans, still soldiers. But for a moment they were fathers, brothers, and sons again. The work of their hands became a silent rebellion, a small act of resistance not against the Americans, but against the cruelty and hatred that had consumed them for so long. Klaus Miller, fanatical soldier turned father, sat huddled under his blanket, carving through the night. The ghosts of his past had returned to guide him, and in their presence, something miraculous began. A small 6-inch wooden soldier emerged from his hands, not holding a rifle, not ready for war, but offering a small loaf of bread. It was a symbol, a prayer, a hope. And in that small creation, Klaus found the first real warmth he had felt since the world had gone mad. In the heart of winter, in a cold Iowa barracks, thousands of miles from the battlefields, a man who had once been trained to destroy found a reason to create. And in that creation, the war inside his soul began to change. Winter in Camp Alona had settled into a strange, almost eerie calm. The snow blanketed the barracks, muting every sound except the occasional whistle of the wind. Klaus Miller moved silently through the camp, carrying small scraps of wood hidden under his tunic. His hands were stiff from the cold and from the unfamiliar work of carving delicate figures, yet his focus was absolute. The sight of the little girl with her rag doll, the memory of his own daughter, had awakened something in him, a need to create, to give life instead of destruction. But the camp was not a safe place for such thoughts. Sergeant Miller, seasoned and watchful, patrolled the barracks with his usual sharp gaze. He did not hate the prisoners, but he did not trust them either. He had seen the arrogant pride of men like Klaus, men who had once commanded soldiers and now walked cautiously under barbed wire. Any hint of rebellion, any sign of hidden activity, could bring swift punishment. Klaus knew the stakes, and yet the need to carve was stronger than fear. In the dim light of the barracks he began work. Small blocks of pine, smoothed and shaped, became tiny soldiers, animals, and toys. Each cut of his knife was careful, precise, deliberate. He worked through the night, hiding his progress under his blanket, shielded from the guards' flashlights. Each creation carried a memory, a prayer, a hope. Eric, the young Luftwaffe pilot, watched Klaus with growing curiosity and quiet admiration. At first, he had laughed at the idea of carving toys, dismissing it as foolishness. But he soon understood that this was more than a hobby. This was a rebellion against the cold machinery of war, against the ideology that had consumed them for years. He approached Klaus one night, whispering, "Are you insane? They will find this. You could go to solitary." Klaus did not look up. His eyes were red-rimmed and glassy, fixed on the tiny soldier in his hand. "I have to," he whispered. "I must create. I must give hope." The words were quiet but carried a weight that settled over Eric. For the first time he felt the stirrings of something long buried, a humanity he had almost forgotten. The barracks, once filled with tension, anger, and resentment, began to change in small ways. Other prisoners, inspired by Klaus, started carving as well. A panzer crewman carefully shaped a small wooden truck. An artillery officer worked on a tiny cradle. Even hardened Africa Corps veterans, men who had been trained to kill without thought, found solace in the rhythmic sound of knife against wood. The air, once heavy with despair, now carried the scent of pine and the quiet scratch of creation. But secrecy was paramount. Sergeant Miller's suspicion grew with each passing day. He noticed the small piles of wood shavings in hidden corners, the slight bulges in tunics, the faint whispering in the barracks at night. He conducted surprise inspections, tearing through foot lockers, flipping mattresses, frisking men, but found nothing. Klaus had been clever. He had hidden pieces under the barracks floor, in the latrines, in places Miller would never suspect. Despite the danger, the men continued. Each night, under the thin wool blankets, they worked silently. The small carvings grew in number and in detail. Klaus carved his masterpiece, the Hope Soldier, a small figure holding a loaf of bread, not a rifle, a symbol of life and humanity amid the horrors of war. Each man poured his grief, guilt, and longing into his creation. The barracks had become a hidden workshop, a place where prisoners reclaimed pieces of their humanity, one small act of creation at a time. The tension in Camp Alona was thick, almost tangible. Sergeant Miller's suspicion hung over them like a shadow, ready to strike. Every scrap of wood, every hidden carving was a risk. One mistake, one slip, and the consequences would be severe. Yet the men continued, driven by a force stronger than fear, hope. As the days passed, the secret workshop became more than just a way to pass the time. It became therapy, a way to atone for past actions. The men who had once been soldiers of death found themselves reclaiming their identities as fathers, brothers, sons. The simple act of carving toys brought a fragile peace, even as the world outside the barbed wire remained engulfed in war. One night, Klaus paused and looked around the dimly lit barracks. Around him, the others worked with quiet focus, their faces illuminated by the pale glow of a single lamp. The air was thick with sawdust, and the silence was broken only by the scratch of knives against wood. In that moment, Klaus realized the magnitude of what they were doing. This was not rebellion in the conventional sense. There would be no battle, no bloodshed. This was a rebellion of the soul. A refusal to let hatred and war consume them entirely. And yet, danger was never far. Sergeant Miller was watching. He could smell the fresh pine in the air, hear the soft scratching that should not have been there. Every night, the men hid their creations, waiting, hoping that Miller would not discover the truth. The secret workshop was a delicate balance between risk and necessity, between fear and hope. Klaus Miller, once a soldier trained to kill without question, now worked with a different purpose. He was no longer fighting for the Reich. He was fighting for something far more profound. A chance to reclaim humanity, to create a small spark of life in a world consumed by destruction. Each carving, each tiny figure, was a silent act of defiance, a statement that even in the darkest winter, even in the coldest prison, hope could survive. And so, in the hidden barracks of Camp Alona, the war continued, but in a different form. Not with guns or artillery, not with bombs or orders, but with knives, wood, and the quiet courage of men who dared to create. Each night, the secret workshop grew, each carving became a prayer, and each man, prisoner or soldier, discovered that even in captivity, the human spirit could not be broken. December had settled over Camp Alona like a heavy, silent blanket. Snow drifted across the barbed wire fences, muting the sounds of the world outside. Inside the camp, life followed a steady rhythm, work, meals, roll call, but beneath this calm, something extraordinary was unfolding. Klaus Miller and his comrades had been secretly carving toys for weeks, their hidden workshop a fragile rebellion against fear and despair. But now, a new opportunity had arrived. One that could protect their secret and allow their creations to reach the world beyond the fences. Edward Kibb, a talented artist and one of the prisoners, had noticed the tiny carvings Klaus and the others were making. Unlike the soldiers, he had an eye for detail, for beauty, for the way small acts could carry immense meaning. He approached Klaus one evening, his breath clouding in the cold air, and whispered, "What if we don't hide anymore? What if we make this visible, make it official?" Klaus looked at him, eyes wide, hesitant. The idea was dangerous. Sergeant Miller's suspicion had grown with every day of their secret work. One wrong move, one misplaced word, and the men could face severe punishment, or worse. Yet Edward's plan carried a spark of hope, a way to turn the impossible into a shield. The next morning, Edward and Klaus filed a formal petition with Colonel Arthur Lobdell, the camp commander. They requested tools, paint, wood, and access to a large space to construct a nativity scene for the camp. Their reasoning was simple yet persuasive. Christmas was approaching, spirits were low, and creating a nativity could boost morale for both prisoners and guards. The colonel, a thoughtful man involved in the denazification program, saw the potential. He approved the project, not knowing that hidden within the nativity would be hundreds of secret carvings, a silent message of hope and humanity. The camp erupted in activity. Lumber arrived, tools were distributed, and prisoners were assigned to work under the official supervision of guards. Sergeant Miller's face twisted with suspicion and irritation. He could not understand why these men, trained killers, were suddenly entrusted with so much freedom. His orders were clear: maintain discipline, enforce rules, and watch carefully. Yet the prisoners moved with purpose, mixing concrete, cutting wood, and painting figures, all under the guise of building a traditional nativity scene. In the shadows of this official project, the secret workshop continued. Klaus and the others used hidden compartments, false bottoms and crates, and gaps within the manger to conceal their delicate carvings. Each night, under the dim light of lamps and the pale glow of the moon, they worked tirelessly. Small soldiers, animals, spinning tops, dolls, each piece carried memories, prayers, and the desire to restore a fragment of humanity to a world consumed by war. The contrast between the surface project and the hidden rebellion created a tension that could be cut with a knife. Every guard's step, every unexpected inspection, every sound outside the barracks was a threat. Yet Klaus worked with singular focus. He carved the Hope Soldier, a small figure holding a loaf of bread, as a personal offering to the little girl in red, the child who had unknowingly sparked this wave of creation. Sergeant Miller grew more agitated with each passing day. The scent of fresh pine lingered in the air, and the faint scratching of knives reached his ears even when he thought the barracks were quiet. He intensified inspections, frustrated by the lack of evidence. The prisoners, aware of the danger, grew more meticulous. The secret workshop had become an exercise in stealth, ingenuity, and courage. Meanwhile, the official Nativity project advanced rapidly. Edward Kibb's artistic vision transformed the camp yard. The manger grew larger, the figures more detailed, the entire display a masterpiece. It was a public act of creativity, sanctioned by the colonel, visible to guards and the prisoners alike. But hidden within, behind panels and under floorboards, were hundreds of secret carvings, the silent voices of men reclaiming their humanity. For the POWs, the project became more than a distraction. It was a shield, a way to continue their hidden rebellion while complying with orders. It was a delicate balance. The world saw a simple nativity scene, while the hearts of the men poured into the hidden toys and figures that would one day carry their message of hope beyond the barbed wire. Klaus Miller, exhausted but determined, looked at the growing nativity with a mix of awe and anxiety. Each piece of wood, each carving, each hidden compartment was a risk. One mistake could destroy everything. Yet the project also offered protection, a way to ensure that the little acts of creation, the Hope Soldier, the carved animals, the spinning tops, would survive the cold scrutiny of war. As Christmas approached, the tension reached its peak. The camp was alive with activity, but the secret of the hidden toys remained intact. Klaus knew that the true test was yet to come. The final reveal, the moment when the children and townspeople would see the hidden creations, would determine if all their courage and ingenuity had been worth it. In the heart of winter, beneath the watchful eyes of guards and the cold gaze of ideology, a small act of human rebellion had blossomed into something extraordinary. The official Nativity project provided cover, yes, but it also provided a stage for a lesson far greater than any drill or military tactic could teach. In the hands of prisoners trained to kill, hope had become a tangible living thing. And in that hope, the first real victory of humanity over hate had been quietly won. The air in Camp Bologna was thick with tension. Snow fell steadily outside, covering the barracks, the fields, and the winding paths in a soft, deceptive calm. Inside, the prisoners worked quietly, finishing the final touches on their hidden carvings, every movement precise, every breath measured. Klaus Miller, exhausted but determined, looked at the pile of secret toys he and the other men had created. Hundreds of small wooden figures, dolls, trucks, animals, and soldiers, all carved with love, hope, and silent prayers, lay hidden beneath the manger, behind false panels, and in secret compartments. Sergeant Miller, meanwhile, had grown increasingly uneasy. He could sense something amiss, though he could not yet pinpoint it. The scent of fresh-cut pine lingered in the air, a subtle reminder of the prisoner's nighttime activities. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, scanned every corner, every shadow, every pile of wood. He had walked past hundreds of pieces of hidden craftsmanship without noticing, but tonight instinct tugged at him like a warning. Something was different. On the evening of December 24th, the camp was unusually silent. The official nativity display was complete, a magnificent structure crafted by the prisoners under the supervision of the guards, stretching 60 feet wide in the center of the camp yard. Shepherds, wise men, Mary, Joseph, and animals adorned the manger, painted and arranged perfectly. Lights, simple but effective, cast a soft glow on the scene. The camp commander, Colonel Lobdell, had invited the townspeople to attend a Christmas Eve viewing, unaware that hidden within the display were hundreds of secret creations, each with a story, each a silent act of rebellion. As the prisoners stood at attention in the barracks, Klaus felt a nervous excitement. The secret of their workshop, the Hope Soldier, the dolls, the tiny trucks, was finally on the brink of being revealed, though not yet to the world. He knew the danger. If Sergeant Miller discovered the toys now, their careful balance of secrecy and creation could shatter in an instant. Sergeant Miller's patience snapped that evening. He entered the workshop alone, following the faint scent of pine. His boots crunched in the snow as he approached the massive nativity. Something in the air felt off. He stepped inside, eyes scanning the manger. His heart pounded. Every inch of the display seemed normal, almost perfect. But then, something caught his eye. A loose panel, slightly out of alignment. Miller's instinct screamed. He grabbed a crowbar, prying at the panel. The wood splintered, revealing what lay behind. His breath caught as hundreds of small wooden toys tumbled onto the floor, soldiers, horses, spinning tops, dolls, tiny trucks, and carved animals. The sound echoed through the workshop like thunder in the dead of night. Miller froze, staring in disbelief. This was not what he expected. There were no weapons, no radios, no escape plans, only toys. Toys carved by men who had been trained to kill, who had once believed in hate, now offering something pure, something human. Klaus stepped forward slowly, holding the Hope Soldier in his hands. "It is for the girl," he whispered, voice trembling. "The one with the red scarf. The one who lost her doll." He extended the small figure to Sergeant Miller. The weight of the gesture hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For a long moment, silence reigned. Sergeant Miller's face was unreadable. Then, as his eyes fell on the soldier holding a loaf of bread, something inside him shifted. Memories of his son, Private John Miller, fighting in the snow-covered forests of Europe, flashed in his mind. The anger, suspicion, and rigidity melted into something new, something like understanding. The rage that had consumed him for weeks, the fear that the prisoners were plotting against him, evaporated. Klaus's eyes, hollow and tired, met Miller's. No words were spoken. The soldier in his hands, a tiny wooden figure, carried more meaning than any report, any order, any drill ever could. Miller took the Hope Soldier, holding it as carefully as if it were made of glass. His knuckles whitened as he felt the texture of the wood, the careful craftsmanship, the humanity embedded in every cut, every curve. Outside, the townspeople of Alona gathered in the snow, murmuring in curiosity and confusion. The camp gates opened and Sergeant Miller, holding boxes filled with the hidden toys, stepped out. Children gasped and stepped forward, their eyes wide with wonder. One by one, the prisoners' creations were distributed to the townspeople, to the children, to families who had never expected a gift from the enemy. The transformation was immediate. Suspicion turned to joy, anger to awe, and the bitter cold of winter seemed to retreat as the warmth of human kindness filled the air. Klaus watched from the shadows, standing beside Sergeant Miller. Around him, the men who had been prisoners, soldiers, and ideologues now saw the impact of their secret rebellion. Their toys, small acts of creation born of grief and longing, had become a bridge between enemies, a testament to humanity's resilience. That Christmas Eve, the war outside Camp Alona seemed distant, almost irrelevant. Inside, a miracle had occurred, not of divine intervention but of human courage, creativity, and kindness. The secret workshop, once hidden in shadows, had fulfilled its purpose. The Hope Soldier and hundreds of other carvings had carried the prisoner's message of redemption, healing, and love beyond the barbed wire fences. Klaus Miller, standing quietly as children clutched the toys he had made, felt a strange lightness in his chest. The ghosts of his past, the weight of years spent in war and hatred, began to lift. In their place, a fragile hope emerged. A hope that even in the darkest of times, small acts of kindness could shatter despair, rebuild trust, and perhaps change the course of hearts forever. The snow had melted and the first signs of spring were creeping into Iowa, but the memory of that extraordinary Christmas Eve remained vivid in the hearts of everyone at Camp Alona. The prisoners, once hardened soldiers of the Third Reich, now carried a quiet understanding of something far greater than orders, propaganda, or ideology. They had witnessed the power of kindness, the weight of a single act, and the surprising strength of hope. Klaus Miller stood at the edge of the camp, looking out at the rolling fields that had first shocked him months ago. They were no longer just fields of corn or wheat. They were symbols of a world untouched by the hatred that had consumed Europe. His hands, once trained for destruction, now held tools for creation, carving memories into wood, shaping a new future one figure at a time. Around him, the men who had been his comrades in war, his enemies in ideology, had learned the same lesson. They were not soldiers here, they were fathers, brothers, sons, men reclaiming their humanity. The news from Europe, however, reminded them that the world beyond Camp Alona remained harsh and unyielding. Battles raged in the Ardennes, the Bulge was unfolding, and countless families endured loss and fear. Among these stories was Private John Miller, Sergeant Miller's son, whose letters had been sparse, whose fate had been unknown for weeks. But fate had its own plans. In early 1945, news arrived that John Miller had survived. He had been liberated from a German prison camp, emaciated, frostbitten, but alive. Sergeant Miller's relief was quiet, profound, a private joy he shared only in the small moments when the camp was silent. The prisoners, too, faced their own journeys home. In 1946, after the war had officially ended, they were repatriated to Germany. Klaus Miller returned to Stuttgart, a city reduced to ash and rubble. The streets he had once walked with pride were now ghostly reminders of a world that had been consumed by hatred and destruction. But among the ruins he carried a small treasure in his pocket, the hope soldier he had carved months earlier. A tiny figure holding a loaf of bread, representing hope, humanity, and the fragile power of compassion. His first stop was a refugee camp, where his daughter Annalisa had survived the chaos of war. When Klaus held her for the first time in 6 years, he felt the weight of all he had endured lift slightly. The carving in his hand was no longer just a toy, it was a bridge between his past and his future, a testament to survival, love, and the lessons of Camp Alona. Back in Alona, Iowa, Edward Kibb's nativity scene remained a lasting symbol of that extraordinary Christmas. Each year, the town placed a small wooden soldier holding a loaf of bread next to the manger, a quiet homage to the men who had risked everything to create hope in the midst of darkness. Visitors who saw it marveled at the craftsmanship, unaware of the hidden stories of redemption, courage, and humanity that had shaped every figure. For Sergeant Miller, the experience left a lasting impression. The rage he had felt, the fear for his son, and the suspicion of the prisoners had all been transformed into a quiet respect for the power of human creativity and kindness. He had witnessed firsthand that even the hardest hearts could soften, that even those trained for violence could choose compassion. The lessons of that winter remained with him, guiding his actions and his understanding of what it meant to truly lead. Across continents, across the rubble of post-war Germany and the quiet farms of Iowa, the legacy of Camp Alona endured. It was not in battles won, territories seized, or medals awarded, it was in the small, secret acts of creation that had rekindled humanity in the hearts of men once consumed by hate. The carvings, the toys, the nativity, they were symbols of hope, proof that even in the darkest winter of human history, a single act of kindness could light the way forward. And so, the story of Klaus Miller, Sergeant Miller, Edward Kibb, and the hundreds of men who had carved, painted, and hidden their hopes' lives on. It reminds us that war can break the body, destroy cities, and erase borders, but it cannot destroy the human spirit. The smallest gestures, the quietest acts of creation, can bridge divides, heal wounds, and illuminate the path from darkness to light. In the end, Camp Alona was more than a prison. It was a crucible of humanity, a place where enemies became creators, where fear became courage, and where acts of kindness, tiny, fragile, and painstakingly carved, shattered the walls of hate. And today, if one looks carefully at Edward Kibb's nativity, they will see a small, weathered wooden soldier holding a loaf of bread, standing as a timeless reminder. Even in the coldest, darkest winter, hope can endure.